Joining me now is Ben Kingsley, Chair at the Property Investor Council. Ben and his team of volunteers play a crucial role in advocating for the rights of property investors in the rapidly changing legislative landscape. Ben, thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me, Tim.
So let's start with PICA, Property Investors Council of Australia. What do we do?
Yeah, so we're a non-for-profit association and we've got two sort of mandates. We want to advocate to make sure that the governments and all the regulators understand the needs of the property investor, because at the end of the day, we're obviously the small business owner providing private rental accommodation. And also for those investors themselves, we're interested in making sure that they have a lot of education so they're not going to get spruiked to or get advances in regards to property investing.
Okay, so not-for-profit, and who do you really represent? All end property investors?
Yeah, so there's 2.3 million property investors across Australia, and we're advocating and representing them as part of our membership base. So we're looking at all the different regulations and changes that are coming through, as well as just giving them education about the types of investments they can do in the market.
Okay, so it's widely publicised that property investors in Australia, 72% of them maybe only own one investment property. The media rhetoric is that they're all, Mr. Scrooge with lots of investment properties. So, how are you going to change the narrative through PICA?
Well, I think it really is important that there is definitely a lot of changes around housing affordability, and there's a lot of blame going on to those private rental accommodation providers. So we need to make sure that people understand that they are providing an essential service. 90% of all rental stock in this country is actually provided by private mum and dad investors, as we're known. And so as part of that particular story, we want to make sure that if the consequences of changing legislation too much could reduce supply, and obviously off the back of that, the people that these so-called politicians and regulators are trying to help could actually hinder them in terms of having less supply, which means higher rents, and also from an economic point of view, less human mobility, and that's really important for economic activity.
Okay, so you touched on obviously the rising rents, which has been widely publicised for the last few years. So what about on the tenant side of things? Like, there's got to be some sort of balance there, isn't there?
Yeah, absolutely. So they're our customers. As private rental accommodation providers, we're these small business operators, we want to make sure that our customers are happy in the property that they're renting. So safe and quiet enjoyment is essential. So we want to make sure that they're having a reasonable time of it. But at the end of the day, it's still a business. And so we still need to get a return on that investment. And so if the regulation gets too restrictive and the investor feels like they're not in control of their property, ultimately we have a risk of them selling out of the market. Now, if we then expand that further, imagine if we had thousands of investors or small business owners getting out of the market, there's that massive shortage. But then the government has to find all of that revenue, i.e. taxes, higher taxes for everyone, to provide that public housing if that private investor is not providing that accommodation.
Okay, so there has been a lot of changes in legislation recently. A lot of the time, it seems like a bit of a knee-jerk reaction to make these big changes, and it often goes and affects the very people they're trying to actually change it for and benefit. Can we talk a bit about some of these changes?
I think what we understand is, so roughly around 5% of rentals potentially end in some type of dispute. And that could be generated through also from the owner who has a situation where the tenant may not be paying rent. But it also could be the other side where the tenant is complaining about things that aren't working in the property and the maintenance on the property or the safety of the property is at risk. And so they potentially go and make a complaint about that, and then it ends up in tribunals. Now, so coming back to your question is like, well, that's around maybe 5%. Let's call it 10%. But the other 90% of relationships actually work out well. Now, of course, if I'm a customer, I want to have the cheapest possible prices for the best possible asset. But obviously from the business's point of view, they want to make sure that they're getting an adequate return for the risk that they're taking in providing that private rental accommodation.
Okay. So what are some of the consequences of some of these legislative changes, like for the end investor, and then again, that flow-on effect for tenants?
Yeah, so let's use Victoria as a perfect example. So we've seen Victoria come in and make 133 changes.
Is that all?
To their, that's it. To their rental, sort of reforms in Victoria. In addition to that, we've seen them also slug the small business owner higher taxes in terms of higher land taxes. Now, the consequence of that is we've seen over 22,000 less rental properties now available for rent in Victoria. So we're seeing the marketplace respond to that overreach from the regulators and the governments, and that's causing an immense shortage of rental accommodation in the state, and that's going to have long-term consequences in terms of economic activity. If I'm thinking about starting a business, whether it's small or big, and I'm looking for talented people, if there's no accommodation there for those people to come in, well, what are we going to do? And also, if we think about the student accommodation, if there's no accommodation, how can those, universities get those international students coming here, which is also driving tens of billions of dollars of investment into the state.
Yeah, so the flow-on effects are huge.
Massive. They're really, really large.
Okay, so we've touched on Victoria, obviously got it wrong. Are any states doing it right?
Well, I think if we look at the example in Western Australia, we saw that they took the information from both the Real Estate Association and also from PICA about the risk of reducing their rental supply. So rather than introducing no grounds evictions, they decided to still keep that in play, but they've also incentivised those types of investors to potentially move from short-term rental into long-term rental market. So a $10,000 incentive to move that, to provide for that. But just those decisions around no grounds evictions, we've seen a flood of investment. Tens of billions of dollars are now flowing into Western Australia to provide adequate
quite the opposite
supply.
Happening here in Victoria.
Correct, and we've got population growth moving there. The economy's moving strongly. So Western Australia have done a real service to both their small business owners, but also the tenants of that state, because if we get that higher supply, rents will be of reasonable level.
Makes sense. Okay, so in terms of advocacy work that PICA does, so you start to see that it could be these changes. How does PICA get involved and actually speak to government about these things?
Well, so the biggest thing for us is with over sort of 2.5 million investors, we want to make sure that they become members of PICA.
Okay.
So that through that membership and through that size, we then have a lot of influence and we can communicate messages out to our small business owners. Okay. So that is an important part of that. In addition to that, obviously when the regulators and politicians are talking to us, we've got clout in that conversation, having 50,000, 100,000 members and also having that network of influence, that is going to inform those decisions, because the worst thing we want is less of that investment, because it will mean the governments are going to have to kick in, and that's higher taxes for all.
Okay, that's interesting. So what does the future look like in terms of advocacy for PICA right now? What is it that we're really battling with today?
So the main ones are about getting the balance right between tenants' rights and also running the small business, so we get an adequate return for investment. Like ultimately, if we can get a better return somewhere else, we may not be spending those tens of billions of dollars in investing in private rental accommodation. We'll go and put our money elsewhere. So it's about getting that balance right. So we want to have a seat at the table in some of those negotiations. So rather than just relying on the property managers and the Real Estate Association and the industry, it's actually really important to hear from the actual owner of the property and what their needs are. Because if I'm a property manager and I'm fearful of losing you as my client, and that's going to affect my business, I'm actually going to say, look, it's not that bad. It's going to be okay. But in reality, it's not necessarily okay. So we need to have our own voice when it comes to those negotiations with the regulators and with the politicians.
Okay, fair enough. So with recent interest rate rises, obviously the property investors got to wear a lot of those costs. Yes, there's been some rental increases as well, but sounds like another membership. It's another few $100s. How much is a membership with PICA?
It's only $5, Tim. So $5 for a year or $20 for 5 years. And obviously that money allows us to, we're all volunteers. No one's paid inside the association. So just getting you on board and being able to communicate to you. So you can go to the website. You can also get our newsletter for free. So obviously you can learn a bit more about us before maybe you decide to give us that $5 investment. But it is really about making sure that we're protecting the interests of those small business operators who run private rental accommodation.
Okay, very good. And I suppose in terms of negative gearing, we must have an election coming up. It's in the news again. So what about negative gearing? How does that play into the work that the advocacy that you're doing works?
Again, it all comes down to the optics. So ultimately, if we're thinking there's housing affordability, we need to blame someone. It's never the politician's fault. It's always someone's fault. So they're thinking that it's actually investors' fault. Even though we only control about 30% of the supply, they still think it's an investor problem. So they're trying to politically look at the situation and sort of saying, how can we get that that argument correct. And so they look at negative gearing, they look at capital gains, all of those types of things. And we're sort of saying, look, you've got to get the incentive right, because if you don't get that investment, then ultimately we all pay more. There's going to be less accommodation, there's going to be less economic activity, and ultimately higher rents for those people that they're trying to protect.
But Ben, isn't negative gearing making the rich get richer and the poor poorer? That's the thing, isn't it?
Well, again, you know, depending on how you look at the data, if you look at the volume of investors, say nurses, teachers, police officers, firemen, there's a vast majority more of those who are using negative gearing, which is just basically a moment in time, you know, where they're potentially getting a support in running their small business versus maybe an anaesthetist or a GP. And so there's a lot smaller number of those. They obviously do get a slightly better tax benefit because they've got higher income. But the risk we have here is if you take negative gearing away, those anaesthetists and those doctors and those higher income earners, they can still go about their business. But certainly a nurse or a teacher or something like that who's trying to provide financial security for their family, they ultimately, without that little bit of extra support, they may not invest in property, and that ultimately, again, causes the unintended consequences that we're talking about.
Yeah, okay. Well, very enlightening, Ben. Thank you very much for joining us. For people that want to join PICA, what's the best way to do that?
Yeah, just head to the website pica.asn.au and they can learn more about us there.
Terrific. Thanks so much for joining us, Ben. That's the play for the day. This is Tika. We'll be right back.
You're watching Ticker. We'll have more in just a few minutes.